Somber. In the early hours of April 15, 1912, the world watched in horror as the RMS Titanic, the so-called unsinkable ship, met its tragic fate. After striking an iceberg during its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York City, the Titanic took a mere 2 hours and 40 minutes to descend into the frigid abyss of the North Atlantic Ocean. This catastrophe claimed the lives of more than 1,500 passengers and crew, etching itself into history as one of the deadliest maritime disasters ever recorded. Yet, within the broader scope of this calamity, there lies an overlooked chapter, a fragment of history that was nearly erased from the public consciousness. Among the approximately 700 survivors were 8 Chinese men traveling in third class, seeking new opportunities in America. However, only 6 would make it through the night, their survival overshadowed by the prevailing racial prejudices of the era. These men, whose names were Fang Ling, Li Bing, Chang Chip, Ah Lam, Chung Fu, and Ling He, found themselves thrust into a narrative that would largely ignore their existence. The circumstances of their survival were not only remarkable, but also marred by the shadows of discrimination. Allegedly, upon reaching the safety of the Carpathia, the rescue ship that came to the aid of the Titanic survivors, these men were met with disdain and suspicion. At a time when the Chinese Exclusion Act was in full force in the United States, they were not welcomed as survivors, but rather viewed as unwanted aliens. As we explore their stories, we uncover how international policies and racial discrimination conspired to silence their voices, effectively erasing their narratives from the collective memory of the Titanic disaster. This documentary seeks to bring to light these forgotten tales, to restore the names and stories of these men to their rightful place in history. Urgency. Who were these men and why were their stories left untold for so long? Join us as we delve deeper into the lives of the Chinese survivors of the Titanic, unraveling the mystery that history tried to erase. Somber. On the night of April 14, 1912, the RMS Titanic, the so-called unsinkable ship, struck an iceberg and descended into the icy depths of the North Atlantic Ocean. It was a tragedy that would claim more than 1,500 lives and captivate the world's attention. Newspapers around the globe chronicled the tales of heroism and the heartbreaking loss of life, stories that have been retold countless times through the decades. Among the survivors, however, there were 6 men whose stories have remained largely untold. These were the 6 Chinese passengers who miraculously survived the disaster, only to find their experiences overshadowed and their presence quietly erased from the annals of history. In the early hours of April 15th, when the Carpathia arrived to rescue the Titanic's survivors, among them were 6 Chinese men, part of a group of 8 who had boarded in Southampton. Unlike many others, their names rarely appeared in survivor accounts, and their stories were seldom shared. But why were these men forgotten? What societal forces were at play that led to their erasure? At the time, anti-Asian sentiment was rampant, fueled by restrictive immigration laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act in the United States, which had been enacted in 1882. This legislation was part of a broader pattern of racial discrimination and xenophobia that permeated Western societies. As the Carpathia docked in New York, these survivors were met not with sympathy, but with suspicion and disdain. Allegedly, they were detained and swiftly deported, their brief moment in the spotlight quickly extinguished. The erasure of these men from Titanic lore is not just a footnote in history, but a reflection of the racial prejudices of the early 20th century. The treatment they received underscores the harsh realities faced by immigrants during this era, where one's survival was overshadowed by the color of their skin. Tonight, we delve into this forgotten chapter, examining the societal biases that sought to render these survivors invisible. We aim to illuminate their stories and honor their resilience in the face of adversity, bringing to light the harsh truths of a world that sought to forget their existence. Urgency. Stay with us as we uncover the mechanisms of exclusion and the untold narratives of the Chinese Titanic survivors. The story of the 6 Chinese survivors of the Titanic, often overshadowed by more prominent narratives, begins not in the bustling port of Southampton, where the majority of the Titanic's passengers commenced their ill-fated journey. Instead, these men embarked at the port of Cherbourg, France, a lesser-known departure point for the ship, on April 10, 1912. Cherbourg served as a critical stop for the Titanic, allowing it to pick up additional passengers after leaving Southampton. Among the diverse group boarding at Cherbourg, the 6 Chinese men, Fang Lang, Ah Lam, Len Lam, Chung Fu, Ling He, and Li Bing, were third-class passengers, a status that reflected the socio-economic realities of the time. These men were part of a contingent of Chinese laborers who were contracted by the British shipping company Donaldson Line. The company, like many others during the early 20th century, sought inexpensive labor to support its operations across the globe. At the time, Chinese laborers were frequently employed under arduous conditions, often facing discrimination and exploitation. Their employment was part of a broader pattern of Chinese migration driven by the promise of economic opportunity, albeit at the cost of grueling work and prolonged separation from their families in China. On April 14, 1912, at precisely 11:40 p.m., the Titanic's encounter with an iceberg in the frigid North Atlantic Ocean set off a catastrophic chain of events. The ship, deemed unsinkable, began taking on water rapidly. Panic and chaos erupted on the decks as passengers hurried to the lifeboats. The protocol of the time, women and children first, dominated the evacuation efforts. However, many lifeboats departed half-empty due to disorganization and the sheer disbelief that the Titanic was sinking. In this pandemonium, the 6 Chinese men faced a dire struggle for survival. Despite the barriers of language and racial prejudice, they managed to find refuge in the lifeboats. Fang Lang's story stands out. He was discovered clinging to wreckage by the crew of the RMS Carpathia, the ship that steamed to the rescue several hours later. Fang Lang's fortitude in the face of the icy Atlantic waters was instrumental in his survival, and he was one of the last people rescued from the sea. The Carpathia reached New York Harbor on April 18, 1912. However, the reception for the Chinese survivors was far from the warm welcome given to other survivors. The United States at that time was under the shadow of the Chinese Exclusion Act, a federal law enacted in 1882 and extended in 1902, which severely restricted Chinese immigration. This law was a product of widespread anti-Chinese sentiment that had developed in the 19th century amidst economic competition and cultural tensions. Upon arrival, rather than being celebrated for their survival, the 6 men were subjected to severe scrutiny. The prevailing racial prejudices meant they were detained and questioned rigorously. Within 24 hours, they were deported. Their quick expulsion was a stark reminder of the institutional racism they faced, and it ensured that their stories remained largely unheard. The deportation meant these men could not share their harrowing experiences of one of the greatest maritime disasters in history. Instead, they were quietly sent to Cuba to continue their work under their labor contracts, their survival reduced to a mere footnote in the larger Titanic narrative. The fate of these 6 men reflects a broader historical oversight. Their exclusion from the mainstream Titanic story underscores a period when racial biases dictated whose stories were deemed worthy of being told. Today, as we endeavor to uncover and acknowledge all facets of history, the experiences of survivors like Fang Lang, Ah Lam, Len Lam, Chung Fu, Ling He, and Li Bing serve as poignant reminders of the resilience and fortitude of marginalized communities throughout history. Somber. As the years slipped by, the stories of the Chinese survivors of the Titanic were shrouded in silence, their existence almost forgotten by the annals of history. This was not merely an oversight, but a consequence of the racial prejudices that pervaded the early 20th century. These men, who had endured the same harrowing ordeal as their fellow passengers, were given scant recognition, their narratives overshadowed by a society eager to overlook them. It wasn't until the latter part of the 20th century that a concerted effort to unearth their stories began to take shape. Researchers and historians, driven by a commitment to uncover the truth, embarked on a painstaking journey. Their quest was akin to piecing together a fragmented mosaic, relying heavily on ship manifests, passenger lists, and immigration records that had long omitted or obscured their names. The paper trails were distorted by decades of bias and neglect, making this historical detective work an arduous process. The researcher's path was fraught with challenges, not least the distorted narratives of the time. Initial clues came from the accounts of fellow survivors and a handful of newspaper articles that mentioned the men dismissively as Chinese stowaways. These articles, laced with xenophobic undertones, painted them in a negative light, perpetuating stereotypes and further marginalizing their plight. Yet through meticulous cross-referencing and persistent investigation, a clearer picture gradually began to emerge. Central to this story is the impact of the Chinese Exclusion Act, implemented in the United States in 1882. This legislation was a reflection of the era's deeply ingrained xenophobia and racism, specifically targeting Chinese immigrants. It restricted their entry into the country and dehumanized those who managed to make it in, reducing their presence to mere economic utility in the eyes of the law. This act not only affected immigration policies, but also contributed to the erasure of the Chinese survivors' experiences in the aftermath of the Titanic disaster. In the immediate wake of the catastrophe, the Chinese Exclusion Act facilitated the rapid deportation of the Chinese survivors. While survivors of other nationalities were interviewed extensively and their stories preserved, these men were swiftly removed from public consciousness. Their deportation underscored a broader societal tendency to erase or ignore narratives that did not fit the prevailing cultural norms or expectations of the time. The tide began to turn when James Cameron's 1997 blockbuster film Titanic rekindled global attention on the ship's tragic voyage. The film's dramatization of the disaster introduced a new generation to the events of that fateful night, sparking curiosity about the lesser-known stories of the ship's passengers. Among these were the 6 Chinese men whose stories had been largely ignored. By the dawn of the 21st century, a renewed interest in these forgotten survivors emerged. Documentaries and books began to explore their lives, aiming to restore the dignity and humanity denied to them for so long. These efforts have been pivotal in illuminating the systemic racism that contributed to their erasure from history. As historians and filmmakers delved deeper, they uncovered not just tales of survival, but narratives that highlighted the resilience and determination of these men against a backdrop of widespread discrimination. The work to humanize these men and acknowledge their survival is not merely about setting the historical record straight. It serves as a broader commentary on the anti-Asian sentiment that was prevalent during the early 1900s and, in many ways, persists today. This exploration into their erased history is a testament to the ongoing struggle to confront and rectify the biases that have long tainted historical narratives. By bringing these stories to light, we not only honor those who were forgotten, but also remind ourselves of the importance of inclusivity and truth in the telling of history. In the years following the Titanic disaster, the stories of the Chinese survivors languished in obscurity, veiled by the shadows of historical oversight and racial prejudice. However, as the 21st century unfolded, a renewed interest began to emerge, led by scholars and filmmakers dedicated to unearthing these long-silenced narratives. Somber. It was not until the early 2000s that the public's perception of these survivors began to shift significantly. Among the catalysts for this change was the discovery of new evidence regarding Fang Lang, one of the 6 Chinese survivors. On the night of April 15, 1912, Lang allegedly clung to a wooden door, floating in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic until he was rescued by the crew of the RMS Carpathia. This poignant image of survival starkly contrasted with the popularized fictional depictions of the Titanic tragedy, providing a tangible connection to the real human experiences of those fateful hours. The documentary The Six, released in 2020 and directed by Arthur Jones, became a pivotal work in bringing these stories to the forefront. Through painstaking research, The film delves into the lives of the Chinese passengers before their ill-fated journey, their experiences during the disaster, and the challenges they faced in its aftermath. The Six reveals not only their personal stories, but also the broader context of Chinese immigration during the early 20th century, marked by widespread discrimination and exclusionary policies such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 in the United States. Fang Lang and his compatriots, who hailed from Guangdong province, were part of a larger group of Chinese laborers who had been employed overseas. Their journey on the Titanic was not one of luxury, but necessity, as they were traveling to join a cargo ship in the Caribbean for work. The film uncovers their struggles, shedding a light on the systemic racism that led to their marginalization both during their rescue and upon their arrival in America. Allegedly, upon reaching the shores of New York, these men were detained and subsequently deported, a stark reality faced by many Chinese immigrants of the era. Despite these revelations, several questions linger. Why were these men overlooked for so long? The answer lies partially in the racial attitudes of the time. The narrative of the Titanic, like much of history, was predominantly shaped by Western perspectives, often marginalizing non-Western voices. This erasure reflects broader issues of historical narrative control, where those in power dictate which stories are preserved and which are forgotten. The rediscovery of the Chinese Titanic survivors' stories has broader implications. It serves as a poignant reminder of the many untold stories lost to history due to systemic racism and cultural biases. These revelations challenge us to reconsider how history is recorded and who is granted a voice in the historical narrative. As more details emerge, the full scope of their experiences continues to unfold, adding new dimensions to our understanding of the Titanic's legacy. Today, the tale of the Chinese Titanic survivors resonates not only as a story of survival, but also as a testament to the resilience of marginalized communities. Their stories encourage a more inclusive approach to historical documentation, prompting a reevaluation of our collective memory. As we remember the Titanic, we are called to acknowledge the complexity of its legacy, ensuring that future generations inherit a more complete and representative account of the past.